In this next session, Professor Philip Schneider will give an overview of biologic and biosimilar medicines, starting with their structure, function, and why they're so important in helping control our healthcare costs. He'll also explain why they're very different from generic medicines. These differences mean that policymakers at all levels of government, from state to provincial up to national governments and even international regulators like the EMA and WHO, have needed to make changes. Things like how the drugs are approved or how they can be substituted at the pharmacy. Even the way the drugs themselves are named and identified have been key issues in the biosimilar field. Professor Schneider will explain what all of these dramatic changes mean for patients and their treatment.
This is a presentation on biologics and biosimilar medicines. It's an introduction to the topic. Let's start with the definition of a biologic medicine. Biologic medicines are substances that are made from living organisms or its products, and it's used for the prevention, diagnosis, treatment, or cure of a disease. Some examples of biologic medicines that I'm sure you're familiar with include vaccines, but also antibodies that are used to treat different conditions that we'll talk about today. Biologics are more difficult to produce, and they're more expensive compared to chemical drugs, and that's creating some concerns about affordability and access that we'll talk about in this series. Because of their complexity, these medicines are almost always given by injection rather than orally through the mouth. And so they're usually given by an intravenous route of administration. If we want to look at the chemical structures of these, given that metaphor, a very simple molecule that I'm sure you're all familiar with, aspirin, is shown in the bottom left-hand side of this diagram, and just a portion of a large biologic molecule is shown in the upper left-hand side of this molecule. And if we look at the entire molecule, such as a monoclonal antibody, such as infliximab, which we'll talk about in this program, you can see that it's quite large and quite complex. So biologic medicines are very important, and they're breakthrough medicines. They've made significant differences in the lives of patients that have serious illnesses such as cancers, blood conditions, conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis that deal with the immune system, and some neurologic conditions such as multiple sclerosis. So if we want to go through two examples, one would be rheumatoid arthritis. This is a very debilitating condition that causes pain and changes in lifestyle. And advances in the understanding of this, the cause of rheumatoid arthritis over the past 2 decades have resulted in new treatments that have reduced this disability and discomfort associated with this condition, often achieving complete remission as a possible goal. Biologic medicines have proved to be effective in slowing down the disease progression and joint damage, resulting in an improvement in the quality of life. Cancer is a good example of a condition that's a devastating diagnosis, and treatment in the past has been associated with really challenging therapies, including surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. But because of the development and understanding of the cancer pathways and the determining factors that result in cancer developing, biotechnology has allowed us to identify cancer treatments that can modify the progression of this disease more effectively than surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. One example would be colorectal cancer that is caused by too much of a certain substance in the body called epidermal growth factor, and the growth factor receptors result in rapidly growing cells, and we can limit that by giving inhibitors to epidermal growth factor receptors, EGFR. We know what biologics are, complex medicines that are produced by living cells, but biosimilars are a new biologic medicine that's intended to copy the original biologic medicine when it loses patent protection. All manufacturers have a certain amount of time to recoup their investment in developing these innovative products, but after a certain period of time, companies can come in and make copies of these. These are similar to what happens with generic molecules, but it's important to know that biosimilars are not generics. A generic drug is an identical copy of a simple molecule, and discounts for generic drugs are substantial, 80 to 90% of the time. And the advantage of these is that they can be automatically substituted at the pharmacy without a physician approval or a new prescription being written. So it's a pretty efficient system, and it's reduced the cost of generic drug, simple molecule therapies substantially. Biosimilars are different in that they aren't identical, and so the discounts aren't quite as significant as with generic drugs, usually 15 to 60% discount, and they cannot be automatically substituted. By automatic substitution, that means that a pharmacy can substitute one medicine for the next. In other words, say a cheaper biosimilar for an originator or a reference product without contacting the physician beforehand. This is a much more controversial concept because it's opposed by many physicians. And in Europe, in fact, this practice is banned throughout most of the European countries. Biosimilars are usually lower cost than the originator product. But not only are they less expensive, but they also, through competition in the market, force originator and biologic medicines to lower their cost as well. In order to get more biosimilars on the market, they have a shorter approval process than the originator biologic. And originator, the first biologic that's produced, has to be evaluated extensively in clinical trials. And these are very expensive and very time consuming. Clinical trials are where a new medicine is tested in patients. And the goal is to find out if the medicine is safe. To lower the developmental costs so that the prices will be lower and to create savings for patients, biosimilars focus more on what's done testing in the laboratory rather than testing in patients. And these are called analytical trials. And so through these laboratory tests, it can be shown whether a biosimilar is similar to the originator biologics and can be actually called a biosimilar. So that's why they're highly similar to the originator product, but not necessarily considered identical. And so since the approval process is shorter and relies less on clinical trials, there's been an increased emphasis on following what happens when these medicines are used in the clinical setting. And we call that real world evidence. That happens after a drug is approved and patients are given a biologic or a biosimilar or switched back and forth. We want to find out if there's any change in the effectiveness of the therapy or any of the side effects that are associated with it. In the European Union, the first biosimilar that was developed was Omnitrope or somatrotin, which is a growth hormone type of product that was approved for use in 2006. There are currently 70 biosimilars available in the EU. In the US, the pathway was approved a little bit later in 2009. We didn't approve our first biosimilar until March of 2015. There are currently 33 biosimilars on the market, 21 of which are available for clinical use in patients. And the holdback happens because of patent issues and other agreements that are made by manufacturers, but these are approved for use in this market. In Canada, the regulatory body for the approval of biologics is the Biologics and Genetic Therapy Directorate of Health Canada. In Canada, there are 45 biosimilars available. In Australia, the regulatory body for approval of medicines is the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or TGA. Their first biosimilar was in 2010, and that was erythropoietin, which is a drug that's used to stimulate red blood cell production. And to date in Australia, there are 39 biosimilars, but not all of them are paid for by the government, which is run by the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. So approval and clinical use are sometimes two different things, as we see in the US and in Australia. In Latin America, there are a variety of different, each country, they don't have a centralized system like we have in the US or they have in Australia or in Canada. These different agencies are responsible for developing their own pathways. The focus is getting these medicines on the market more quickly. In South America, there are 23 biosimilars that are available for, that have been approved for use. So we think that biosimilars are really important because they create new treatment choices for patients and physicians. They're different, so one may work differently than the others, one may work better than the other, one may have fewer side effects than the other. So we can try different versions to see which one works best. They introduce price competition into the market, so it's likely to reduce prices, freeing up resources to spend on other health benefits for patients. And finally, the lower price is due to a competition. So the more biosimilars on the market, the more the originator product must drop its price in order to compete. And so this may result in reduced out-of-pocket costs for patients. The challenges that biosimilars create for patients is who controls the treatment decision, who decides if a patient should receive an originator product versus a biosimilar. The argument being, if we can save money, let's use the less expensive product. But if the product is working well, the decision needs to be made by the physician and the patient. So the options might be to switch from an originator product to a biosimilar, or if there are multiple biosimilars on the marketplace, switching from one biosimilar to the other. If treatment decisions are affecting costs, there may be pressure to switch to the least expensive medicine. So one of the fundamental questions is, what role will you and your physician play in making these decisions? And most physicians are reluctant to switch a patient that's doing well on a current therapy. And so when somebody forces a decision based on cost issues that doesn't take into account the clinical management of the patient, that has created some tension in the marketplace. Since this happens sometimes, it's important to know, either intentionally by the physician or by a payer, it's important to know which medicine is being given to the patient. Is it the originator product, or is it one of several biosimilars that would be made available? And so it's important to be able to tell what medicine the patient is receiving so that we can determine what's working and what's not working, and if there's an adverse event associating with the product that was dispensed to the patient and given to the patient. So the question becomes, how do different countries answer these questions? And we will hear more about this over the next 2 days, and we will hear about patient experiences under the different systems that exist around the world for biosimilars. So with that introduction to the summary, let me conclude with this introductory session, and thank you for your attention, and hoping you will be listening to the other presentations that will build on this foundation.
Thank you, Professor Schneider, for that overview of biologic and biosimilar medicines. As a reminder, our sessions are available for viewing on demand. You can also use the chat function during the presentations to submit a question, or you can reach out to us on social media. Our handle is @GlobalCRC.